Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
The next production to open at the Rose Theatre in Kingston, London, is a new adaptation of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, named by Time magazine as the best novel of 2005. It has been adapted for the stage by Suzanne Heathcote, a British writer now based in Los Angeles, and is directed by Christopher Haydon, Rose Theatre's artistic director. I spoke to Christopher just before rehearsal for the play and asked him why he wanted to bring this particular story to the stage.
I've been an enormous fan. I've had a deep love of Ishiguro's writing ever since I was a student. I remember reading, I think Remains of the Day was the first book of his that I read, and it just floored me in its kind of simplicity, in its stylistic simplicity, yet its extraordinary emotional depth. You know, I read the book way before I saw the film.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on me. And I was fascinated by, you know, a writer who, you know, Ish was born in Japan and moved over here when he was 5. But I was fascinated by a writer whose heritage was Japanese, but who seemed to understand the English sensibility so deeply to his core. And I actually once said to a friend of mine who'd spent a couple of years teaching in Japan, I said, it's interesting, you know, Ishiguro's Japanese, but he seems to really get Englishness. Yeah, English, well, obviously Ish is English, and he grew up in this country, but his Japanese heritage. But he seems to really understand Englishness in this incredibly profound way. And yet those two cultures feel so different. And my friend pointed out, he was like, well, that's not necessarily true. You know, both cultures are very emotionally repressed. Both cultures have a very strong sense of honor and nobility. Yeah. And actually, I thought that was really a really brilliant point. You know, you sort of see that actually there's this incredible connection between two cultures that on the surface seem very, very different, which is why I think his work is so perceptive, because he's able to come from these two different places and yet kind of bring them together. So I'd always loved his books, and he's the only contemporary novelist who, if they publish something, I will go out of my way to read it within a couple of weeks. Like, I don't particularly follow contemporary fiction that closely, but I really do follow his work. And in 2019, I directed the first ever dramatic stage production of Remains of the Day, which we did at Royal and Derngate in Northampton, who are one of our partners on Never Let Me Go, and which we then toured with Out of Joint. And you know, and there's just something in the depth of his writing that I find really profound. And so when I started at the Rose, Never Let Me Go felt like an obvious next step. You know, again, it hadn't been done on stage in English, but there was a Japanese production, but it's never been done in English. It is almost as well known as Remains of the Day. It is a profoundly loved book. And it's a book that, again, that I connected with at a very deep level. I find his kind of combination of hope and melancholy incredibly, incredibly compelling and feel like it really speaks to me. So there had already been an attempt to adapt the book with Suzanne Heathcote, who's our adapter, attached. So it'd been floating in the ether and it hadn't happened. And Suzanne and I share an agent. So I said to my agent, look, I'm really interested in doing Never Let Me Go. I knew Ishiguro from having done Remains of the Day, and I knew that he'd enjoyed that and that he was supportive of me. My agent said, well, look, Suzanne is still really keen to do it. Ish is a big supporter of her, so why don't you guys talk? And we got on, and it felt like an obvious match. And then and that was sort of 3 years ago during lockdown. And then the project really accelerated last year during the writers' strike in America, because Suzanne's, you know, predominantly a TV writer, and she works on, you know, big shows in LA. And she emailed me and said, look, I'm literally not allowed to write anything else. The only thing I can work on at the moment as a writer is Never Let Me Go. So, you know, I'm going to get you a draft as quickly as possible. You need to get me your notes back as quickly as possible, and let's get it done in what turned out to be the 3 or 4 months of the strike. So we had a very, very intense period last year, and it's always nerve-wracking when you get a first draft of something you've commissioned, because particularly if you haven't worked with the writer before, because you've got no idea. You know, you might have a fully rounded play land on your desk. You might have a sort of disconnected series of notes and scenes. You know, you never really know. And Suzanne's first draft was just extraordinary. I mean, it was incredibly emotionally engaging and moving from the first page. And actually to a point where one of my conversations with her was, you know, you've packed so much feeling into this. We now need to marshal that and keep our powder dry until we really, really want to kind of, you know, make it spill out. So, yeah, so that's kind of, you know, that's sort of why I was drawn to the title and to her. And I find the story, it operates on multiple levels. For anybody who, it's obviously a very famous book. For people who don't know the story, it's about a group of, we follow a group of young people at what appears to be a very privileged boarding school called Hailsham. But we sort of realize there's something not quite right. And as the book goes on, you realize that actually these young people are clones and they're being raised to have their organs harvested when they're in early adulthood. So the play operates on several levels. At one level, it's a love story. That's the kind of core of it. But it's also a kind of meditation on mortality. It's a depiction of an apartheid state. That's the phrase that Ish has used before, where people are kind of divided into humans and clones. So it's touching on these huge philosophical ideas, but doing it with this incredible emotional thrust, which I find just very, very compelling.
So it must be quite a risk personally, I suppose, when it's a book that meant such a lot to you, when to adapt it to the stage, you're going to have to lose a lot of it. So what was the process like?
Well, it's interesting because I read the book many, many years ago, and then I reread it probably a couple of years ago around the time, that we were just commissioning Suzanne. And then I hadn't reread it by the time but in the sort of 18 months between then and when Suzanne delivered her draft. And that was kind of deliberate because I thought, well, I need to read the play and see whether it stands on its own 2 feet. And then I reread the book just before going into rehearsals. And it's fascinating because you suddenly realize there are various threads of things in the book that are not in the play. But also there's a lot of stuff that is in the play that is not in the book.
Yeah.
There's a new character that Suzanne has created, a significant new character. There's a whole element of Kathy's story and, life story that is included in the play that isn't present in the book. And so, I think the play does hew closely to the core story of the book and to its core themes, but it absolutely has a life independent of that, which I think is great because I think it means that if you know the book, you will get something new from watching the play, and she's done something rather brilliant in terms of it being a memory play and past and present often existing at the same time on the stage, which is, not something you can do quite the same way in written form in a novel. You see these memories spring to life around Kathy, and that tells you something about her inner life and her emotional landscape. So I think Suzanne's been very, very artful in what she's kept in and left out. So actually it's just after that sort of initial oh gosh, will the first draft kind of be any good? You never know. You sort of realize it is. And then actually the rest of the journey's been really thrilling because, we're just taking this beautiful story and running with it.
And, well, they say you shouldn't meet your heroes. And obviously Ishiguro is a bit of a hero to you. So what's it been like working with him?
Do you know what I literally say to people? They say you shouldn't meet your heroes. And I have in the past met people who I've really idolized and have been slightly let down by. And Ish is quite the opposite. He is absolutely just a lovely man. He was very supportive when we did Remains of the Day. And when we started working on that, it was before he'd won the Nobel Prize. So it's quite fun to be able to send someone an email going, hi, congratulations on winning a Nobel Prize. And then send him another one going, and you've got an Oscar nomination too. That's amazing for living. He's brilliant. He is very, very supportive of me and of Suzanne. He is very engaged, but also hands off. So he gives, if you say to him, can we talk about the script? In his email, he sort of said, look, I love the script. I don't really have many notes, but I'm very happy to chat. And then you end up having a Zoom conversation, which lasts for 2 hours, and it's very easeful. And you're just kind of talking around the story. It's sitting there going, well, Kathy wouldn't say this, or that wouldn't have happened, or that, he totally, when we did Remain to the Day, I remember we were talking about some element and he sort of said, look, Chris, you can set it on a spaceship if you like, the book's going to be fine. So he has this incredible openness. He's a great writer. He has deservedly great confidence in the work that he's made, and he handles that with real humility, but he knows that other artists need to do their thing too. And he's excited by the creative process. And he says himself that, he understands film and he understands novels and he understands music, but he will say himself he doesn't really understand how theatre works or how you write for theatre. He said that in interviews. Now, look, I'm sure he'd write a brilliant play if he tried. But it means that he is then really interested in how we approach things. And he's really willing to let us do what we think it needs, what we think the story needs. So, yeah, I mean, he's a really, really he's just a very easy guy to talk to and a very easy guy to get on with. He's fantastic.
Yeah, and he gives you the space to do what you need to do. Totally.
I mean, he's brilliant.
Yeah. But how are you staging the novel then? It's a cast of 9, which is quite large.
Yeah, so, it's a sort of, I guess, it's a sort of mid-sized show. Tom Piper is designing, and Tom obviously, is very, very hugely experienced designer, spent, decades at the Royal Court, did the poppies around the Tower of London. He's a genius. He thought, when talking to Tom as we've designed it and Suzanne as we've developed the script, the 3 words I've been using are fast, fluid, and light. It is a story that is ultimately very sad, like obviously, inherently, it's a tragedy in one way. But actually, for the most part, it's a story about young people, and a story about young people living their lives to the maximum degree they possibly can. And so it needs a real energy. It needs a real fluidity. And you'll only earn the right to kind of wring the emotion out of it if you have given it that energy at the beginning. The whole thing can't be played as a kind of, it's really sad from the beginning. And actually, Ish himself, when we were talking to him, he sort of said, in some ways, Never Let Me Go is like a romantic comedy. And I was like, is it though? Really? But his point was a really good one, which is, in Remains of the Day, Stevens and Kenton, the 2 protagonists, Stevens' great tragedy in Remains of the Day is that he gets to his latter years and he looks back on his time as a butler and realizes that he'd been serving a man who was a Nazi, a Nazi sympathizer. And so his professional life, although he'd led it with real integrity, was in service of completely the wrong thing. And then he also realizes that Kenton, the housekeeper, who he'd worked with for 20 years, and they had been deeply in love, but they had never admitted their feelings. And by the point that we get to him in the book, it's too late. So he that is a tragedy. Like Stevens' life, he looks back on it and he goes, I could have done so much and I didn't. What is incredibly powerful about Never Let Me Go is that it does the opposite. These are young people who know they're not going to live past their mid-20s, and yet they are able within the narrative to grasp that. And the love story between Kathy and Tommy, it starts out as a love triangle between Kathy, Tommy and Ruth, but ultimately the love story between Kathy and Tommy, they consummate it. They get together, they have their moment. And, that's kind of what Ish meant. A romantic comedy ends with the 2 protagonists getting together. And in this, they get together. And sure, it's really bittersweet, but they have that moment. And so that's the thing. And so my sort of, one of my guiding principles, as well as fast, fluid and light, I've sort of boiled the story down and I say, look, ultimately Never Let Me Go is a story about hope and how even when hope dies, there is still love. And that's the thing we've been focusing on. And so we're staging it in a way that is, the design is kind of quite stripped back. We're sort of like each space is each different location is kind of created by a single item of furniture or a single object, because you want these kind of memories to arise and then dissipate very quickly. You want one thing to turn into another very, very quickly, because that's how memory works. It jumps from left to right to up to down, and you often can't control it. So it needs that fluidity and it needs that lightness of touch and it needs humor. There's a lot of stuff in it that's very, very funny, because kids when they're 6 or 16 are funny. They're riotous. They misbehave. And that's the point of being a kid. And so we get all of that. And then as the show goes on, you watch these kids grow up. And I mean, we actually see, the youngest age we see Kathy at in the play is 6, and the oldest we see is 31, just before she has to check in for her own donations to begin. So actually the play sort of gives us the whole of Kathy's life in a kind of remarkable way. And it doesn't do it in a fully linear way, but it absolutely gives us her whole life in this kind of focused, crucible of the stage. So that's sort of been the focus, just finding that lightness of touch and then keeping the powder dry on the emotion. And then really when it does, when it does get to a point where one of the characters has to break emotionally, then you really kind of lean into it and let it happen. And that gives the audience that catharsis and, that sense of uplift actually that comes from going through something, awful with somebody. So it has, it's always absolutely about sort of balancing the light and the dark and creating something that is bittersweet and beautiful.
It reminded me when you saying that about that discussion you had, the discussions between Stanislavski and Chekhov about whether Three Sisters was a comedy or a tragedy.
The Cherry Orchard, yeah, whether it was a comedy or a tragedy. And it's funny actually because I've been slowly working on my own adaptation of the Cherry Orchard because I love that play.
Yeah,
and it's such an odd play, and I totally understand why Chekhov said it was a comedy because. Yeah. It is because it's really odd. Like the number of times those characters speak at cross purposes, it's fascinating. Kind of the number of times one of them will say something and it doesn't get picked up by the other; it gets ignored, and you realise it is very much a satire of this kind of, sort of slightly absurd social. It's a sort of social satire of this kind of slightly absurd group of people whose tragedy is that they are going to lose the Cherry Orchard, but the comedy lies in the fact that they are both completely blind to it and completely open-eyed to it at the same time, and that sort of paradoxical thing is funny. So ultimately I think the Cherry Orchard is much more critical of its central characters than Never Let Me Go is. I think that's the big difference, but I can definitely see the parallels.
But there is a serious message, perhaps a warning message. Is it like a speculative fiction alternative future in the story as well in there?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a depict. I mean, for a start, it's always worth remembering that the play is actually set in the past. The story takes place over the late 70s to late 90s, so it's an alternative history to the one that we've lived.
Yeah,
and yes, in a way, no. To be honest, I don't actually think the play or the book are particularly interested in genetic engineering as a subject matter or cloning. I don't think the point is to say, oh, we might get to a point with our sort of genetic expertise that we can breed people and harvest their organs. I think actually what it's warning about is much closer to home than that. Like I'm talking to you, I've got my smartphone next to me, which has, coltan in it, which is a a metal that's mined from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I don't know about the specific coltan in this phone, but certainly there is a history of the technology we use requiring bits and pieces from war zones. They are fueling war. And so this notion of a society, Never Let Me Go, that can sacrifice a group of people for quote unquote the greater good is very, very close to us, whether it's, how we have our cell phones made or whether it's, how we kind of burn up, fossil fuels and sacrifice future generations, or, it's not so far from, a society in America that seeks to protect the kind of gun ownership at the literal sacrifice of children almost every day. Mm. So in a way it is, and then of course also, one of the things we've been talking about a lot in the rehearsal room is, examples from the American civil rights struggle, but it's really interesting because, we've talked about Rosa Parks a lot. She was told she had to move seats on the bus and she said no and took a stand. I mean, actually took a seat, but, literally stood up for her rights as a human being. And so that was a segregated society, but it was a society where the people who were being segregated understood that they were being discriminated against and knew that that was wrong. And the difference with Never Let Me Go, the tragedy of the world that Never Let Me Go is presenting, is that the clones, these young people, are so isolated, so insulated, that they only really towards the end of the book begin to even faintly grasp that actually they're living in a society that is deeply unfair and that has essentially enslaved them in a way. And so it's not a story of rebellion. It's not a story of people trying to fight back. And Ish is often asked about that, why don't they fight back? And he makes the point that for the most part, people don't. People accept their circumstances. A fish doesn't know it's in water. People will stay in abusive relationships for a very long time. And drama likes stories of rebellion and stories of resistance, but actually that isn't necessarily the way the world operates. And so Never Let Me Go isn't political in one sense. I mean, every story is political, but Never Let Me Go isn't political in the sense that it's saying this is wrong, we should fight it, and this is how, or this is. It's a society that says this is what society is. It is inherently unjust, but we are going to look at how you survive within the context of that injustice and how you find meaning within the context of that injustice. And that's when it becomes less a kind of capital P political story and more a kind of philosophical interrogation of mortality. Because in the end, whether you've got 25 years or 85 years or 105 years, we all live in a context where it is going to come to an end. And so that question of how you find meaning, how you imbue your own life with meaning, the lives of others around you with meaning, it is the biggest question of all. Yeah. And what Never Let Me Go does is it takes that question and compacts it into the story of, a small number of young people leading very short, but nonetheless very meaningful lives.
And developing new work is something that you've always done back at the Gate and the Bush before that. But it is an expensive way. So this is a co-production you mentioned between Bristol Old Vic and Malvern Theatres and Royal and Derngate. Yeah, it's the Rose, Bristol, Malvern and the Royal and Derngate. And then we, the Rose, are touring the show to Chichester for a week. So it's doing, I think, the total length of the run is 10 or 11 weeks across these different venues. That seems to be a way that theatres are using more and more to be able to fund a production of this scale. I suppose that gives you a lot of possibilities to the co-production. Yeah, I mean, co-production is great in that it allows you to work on a much bigger scale and it allows you to share the work much more widely. It brings with it lots of challenges. Obviously, getting theatres to line up their dates and to agree on work is very, very time consuming. The reason why the industry is so reliant on co-production at the moment is very simple. It's, a decade and a half of cuts to, the arts. I mean, the Rose is not an Arts Council funded theatre, but most of our partner venues are, 14 years of, Tory government cutting Arts Council budgets and more importantly, actually cutting local government budgets. Yeah, so you've got regional theatres that are in real trouble because of the cuts to local government. And the trouble is you had, and the whole approach that the Tories had towards arts funding was completely incoherent because on the one hand, they did some very good things, which are often ignored. Like they introduced tax relief, which was hugely positive. I mean, massively impactful. And, the bailout package over the pandemic was really good, like we'd have all sunk. So, it's not just that the Conservatives were, they are a malign party and I despise them, but their approach to the arts was complicated because on the one hand, they were giving and on the other hand, they were taking away in terms of, the sort of funding assault on the Arts Council, the assault on local government. And of course, most fundamentally, the assault on, arts education in schools, which is, so it's a very, very incoherent approach. And then you have the Arts Council, which is, really passionate about community engagement and really believing in placemaking and theatres kind of being for their local area. And yet theatres are now having to co-produce and not just 2 theatres together, 3, 4, 5 theatres working together. And by definition, if you're co-producing with several different venues across the country, you can't be making work that is really rooted in each of those communities because the show has to exist in very, very different places with very, very different social makeup, very different economic backgrounds and so on. So it's, it is a real mess at the moment. And the people running, the theatres that we're working with, so many theatres, are brilliant people who work incredibly hard and do really, really good work. But we're all kind of struggling against a system which is like breaking at the seams, and we're not able to work with as much flexibility as we'd like to be able to be as kind of ambitious and imaginative as we'd like to be able to take the risk on emerging artists as we'd like to. So it's, you have a lot of very, very talented people working in a structure that is seriously malnourished and seriously damaged. And that's something that's going to take a long time to heal and needs really joined up thinking and a real commitment by everyone to focusing on, we have to be producing really high quality work. That has to be the aim at whatever level you're working. And then we need to find a sort of a business and financial and, cultural infrastructure to support that. And something related to that you've also investigated and written about is class diversity in theatre.
Yeah.
Is that getting worse? It looks like it is from the outside.
So the thing I wrote was about audiences I mean, look, I mean, I wrote that some years ago.
Yeah.
I think definitely, I mean, my friend Tinnika Craig, the very brilliant director, gave an interview. She's just directing Raisin in the Sun at the moment for Headlong, that's touring.
Oh, yes.
And she gave a really good interview the other day to The Guardian where she was talking about the cuts to arts education and to youth engagement will have a very severe impact on, diversity and social inclusion amongst artists in the longer term. In 15 years' time, the people who are in their teens now won't be getting the opportunities that they need in order to get them on the ladder to be, when they're in their 20s and 30s, like making extraordinary work. So it will, there is a real risk that, in one way, we've seen an extraordinary, brilliant, explosive flourishing of diversity in the last 10 or 15 years across the industry. The change of makeup of people leading these organizations, of people directing the shows, writing the shows, the stories that are being told are vastly more diverse and inclusive than they were 10, 15 years ago. And I think we often kind of ignore that, but it's just a fact that things have got a lot better. But without sustained investment, without a kind of focus on young people, the stuff that is less glamorous from a government point of view, the stuff that doesn't have kind of like celebrities attached to it and, shiny opening nights and, big box office numbers at, in the cinema. Without that grassroots stuff, there is a real risk that all the gains we've made will be reversed. And the Labour government needs to really pay attention to that because there's this obvious economic case for it, but also just the kind of, it's about the case for joy, isn't it? Art creates and brings joy. And if we don't have joy in a society, what's the point?
Just to finish, because I know you've got to get away to rehearsals.
Yeah.
You've said that Never Let Me Go is amongst your favourite novels. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else on that list that in a fantasy world you would love to put on stage?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I'd love to do, Ishiguro's next book, Clara and the Sun. There's a 3-year lockout because they're making the film at the moment. So the rights won't be available, I think, for 3 years until after the film comes out. But that's certainly something I'd like to do. We have some really exciting titles under commission at the Rose, but they're not announced yet. I mean, I think I've done a lot of adaptation, and I do think it's a really fruitful and fertile world. But for me, it always comes down to kind of, who's the key artist, whether it's the writer or the performer, or, if I'm producing the director, that's the key relationship that I think sets up the next show. So, yeah.
That was Christopher Haydon, Artistic Director of Rose Theatre Kingston and the Director of Never Let Me Go, adapted by Suzanne Heathcote from the novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, which will run at the Rose Theatre from the 20th of September to the 12th of October 2024, before touring to Royal and Derngate in Northampton from the 16th to the 26th of October, Malvern Theatres from the 29th of October to the 2nd of November, Bristol Old Vic from the 5th to the 23rd of November, and Chichester Festival Theatre from the 26th to the 30th of November. For more information, see www.rosetheatre.org.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.